Welcome back to Verified Fears. Hotels are breeding grounds for paranormal activity. Think about it. Thousands of people have slept in your exact bed, and not all of their stories had happy endings. Tonight, we're covering 11 real encounters from people who experienced something genuinely terrifying during their hotel stays. These aren't made-up ghost stories. These are verified accounts with real names, real hotels, and real evidence that something is very wrong in these places. We've got business travelers, families on vacation, hotel employees, and paranormal investigators, all sharing experiences they wish they could forget. From luxury resorts to roadside motels, nowhere is safe when the dead refuse to leave. So let's check into 11 disturbing true haunted hotel horror stories that will make you sleep with the lights on. Let's move to our first story. And this one comes directly from Bryson, a corporate consultant from Dallas who experienced something that still gives him chills to this day. Here's his account, in his own words. I've been traveling for work for over 15 years, and I thought I'd seen it all when it comes to hotels. Budget motels with questionable stains on the carpet, luxury resorts where the staff knows your coffee order by day 2, and everything in between. I'm the kind of guy who can sleep anywhere, plane seats, airport floors, you name it. But what happened to me at the Grand Marlborough in New Orleans back in March 2019 completely changed how I think about the places I stay. I was in town for a 3-day leadership retreat that my company was hosting. The whole thing was being held at this historic hotel on Royal Street in the French Quarter, and honestly, I was pretty excited about it. I'd been to New Orleans a few times for conferences, but usually stayed in those generic business hotels near the airport. This time, our travel department had booked us at the Grand Marlborough, and I'd even managed to use my Marriott points to upgrade to a junior suite. The hotel was exactly what you'd picture for a historic New Orleans property. Soaring ceilings with elaborate moldings, wrought iron balconies, and that distinctive smell of old wood mixed with magnolia that seems to cling to every building in the quarter. Check-in was perfectly normal. The desk clerk was this friendly woman in her 50s who recognized the corporate booking and had everything ready. She handed me my key cards and mentioned that my room was on the 7th floor, which she said offered some of the best views of the courtyard. I remember thinking the elevator was one of those old-fashioned ones with the brass buttons and ornate mirror. The kind that moves so slowly, you wonder if it's actually broken. My room was 712, and when I opened the door, I was genuinely impressed. High ceilings, a 4-poster bed, antique furniture that looked authentic rather than reproduced, and French doors that opened onto a small balcony overlooking the hotel's interior courtyard. The first day of the retreat went exactly as planned. Boring presentations about synergy and leadership paradigms, the usual corporate stuff. I grabbed dinner with a few colleagues at the hotel restaurant, had a couple of drinks at the bar, and was back in my room by around 10:30. I needed to review some materials for the next day's sessions, so I spread my laptop and papers out on the desk and got to work. The room was quiet, except for the typical New Orleans street sounds drifting up from Royal Street. Jazz music from a nearby club, the occasional tourist group walking by, nothing unusual. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. I just closed my laptop when I heard the elevator ding in the hallway. Now, this wasn't particularly strange. People come and go at all hours in hotels. But what caught my attention was what happened next. I heard footsteps in the hallway, but they weren't the usual sounds of someone walking to their room. These footsteps were different. Light, almost delicate, like someone wearing heeled shoes, but trying to walk quietly. They stopped right outside my door. I waited for the sound of a key card being used or the footsteps continuing down the hall. But there was nothing. Just silence After about 30 seconds, I started to wonder if someone was lost or having trouble with their key card. So I went to the peephole to see if I could help. The hallway was completely empty. No one there at all. I figured maybe they'd gone to a room further down and I just hadn't heard them continue walking. So I shrugged it off and went to bed. The second night was when things got really strange. I'd had another long day of presentations and team-building exercises, and I was honestly looking forward to just ordering room service and relaxing. I'd changed into comfortable clothes and was scrolling through the hotel's room service menu when I heard that elevator ding again. Same time as the night before, right around midnight. And sure enough, those same light footsteps started down the hallway. This time, I was ready. I muted the TV and listened carefully. The footsteps approached my door and stopped, just like before. But this time, I heard something that made my blood run cold. There was a soft knock on my door. Not a normal knock. It was hesitant, almost timid, like someone was afraid to disturb me, but desperately needed help. I went to the peephole immediately, expecting to see another guest or maybe hotel staff. But again, the hallway was empty. Completely empty. I stood there for a good 5 minutes, just watching through that peephole. But I never saw anyone. The knocking didn't repeat, and I didn't hear any footsteps walking away. It was like whoever had been there just vanished. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the old building settling, or sounds carrying from another floor, or even someone knocking on a different door and the sound bouncing off the walls in a weird way. But deep down, I knew what I'd heard, and it didn't have a logical explanation. The third night was my last night, and I was honestly considering asking to change rooms. But I felt ridiculous. What was I going to tell the front desk? That I heard mysterious footsteps and knocking? They'd think I was crazy or drunk. So I decided to stay put. But this time, I was going to be prepared. I set up my phone to record audio and positioned myself near the peephole well before midnight. Right on schedule, the elevator dinged at 12:03 a.m. I started recording and watched through the peephole as those footsteps began their approach. This time, I could actually see something. It was faint, almost translucent. But there was definitely a figure walking down the hallway toward my room. She appeared to be a young woman in what looked like a white dress or gown, and she was moving with that same delicate, careful gait I'd been hearing. As she got closer, I could make out more details. The dress looked like it might be from the 1920s, long with intricate beading that caught what little light was in the hallway. Her hair was styled in finger waves, also consistent with that era. But what struck me most was her expression. Even through the distorted view of the peephole, I could see that she looked lost and confused, like she was searching for something or someone. She stopped right in front of my door, just like the previous nights. But this time she looked directly at the peephole. For a moment, I swear she was looking right at me, and her eyes were filled with such sadness and desperation that I felt compelled to help her somehow. She raised her hand and knocked on the door, the same soft, hesitant knock I'd heard before. Without thinking, I called out, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The moment I spoke, she stepped backward with this look of surprise on her face, almost like she hadn't expected anyone to respond. Then, as I watched, she simply faded away. Not walked away, faded. Like someone was turning down the brightness on a TV until there was nothing left. I stood there shaking, staring through that peephole for another 20 minutes. But she didn't return. I checked my phone recording, And while you could hear the footsteps and knocking clearly, there was also something else. A faint voice, almost like someone whispering, "Help me," over and over again. The next morning, I couldn't resist asking the front desk clerk about the history of the hotel. She told me that the building dated back to the 1890s and had served various purposes over the years, including a brief period as a boarding house for young women in the 1920s. When I mentioned the 7th floor specifically, her expression changed slightly, and she mentioned that they occasionally had guests report unusual experiences on that floor, particularly involving a young woman in vintage clothing. I did some research later and discovered that in 1923, a young woman named Eleanor Dubois had been staying at the hotel the night before her wedding. According to newspaper accounts from the time, she was found dead in her room the next morning, apparently having taken her own life after discovering that her fiancé had been embezzling money from her family's business. The room number listed in the police report was 712, my room. I've stayed in hundreds of hotels since then, but I've never experienced anything even remotely similar. I still have that audio recording on my phone, and sometimes, late at night, I listen to it just to remind myself that it really happened. Whatever Eleanor was looking for that night, I hope she eventually found it. That was Bryson's account of his encounter with what locals now call the Bride of the Grand Marlborough. And it's far from the only supernatural experience reported at that historic hotel. Let's move to our second story, and this one comes from Priscilla Martinez, a mother of 2 from Phoenix, Arizona. What she experienced during what was supposed to be a fun family road trip in the summer of 2021 turned into 3 nights of absolute terror that her family still talks about in hushed tones. Here's Priscilla's account, in her own words. My husband Jameson and I had been planning this cross-country road trip for months. We wanted to show our kids, Emma, who was 12 at the time, and Tyler, who was 9, some of the classic American road trip experience. You know, Route 66, roadside diners, quirky tourist traps, the whole thing. We'd mapped out this ambitious 2-week journey from Phoenix to Chicago, and we were so excited about spending quality time together as a family, especially after being cooped up during the pandemic. Our 3rd day on the road, we were driving through Arizona along the old Route 66 when we started getting tired around 8 in the evening. The kids had been complaining about the Wi-Fi being spotty for the last 100 miles. And honestly, Jameson and I were ready to just find a place to crash for the night. We weren't picky. We'd been staying at a mix of chain hotels and local places, whatever looked clean and safe. That's when we saw the sign for Desert Winds Motel. It was one of those classic neon signs from the 1950s, partially lit up, advertising color TV and air conditioning like those were still selling points. The place looked like it had seen better days, but it was clean enough, and the elderly man at the front desk seemed friendly. He told us they had adjoining rooms available, which was perfect since the kids were getting to that age where they wanted their own space, but we still wanted them close by. He handed us the keys to rooms 237 and 238, mentioning that 237 was the family room with 2 double beds where the kids could stay, and 238 was the room Jameson and I would take. The rooms were connected by one of those doors with locks on both sides. The man seemed normal enough, though I noticed he paused for just a second when he handed us the key to 237, almost like he was going to say something, but then just smiled and told us checkout was at 11. The first thing I noticed when we walked into room 237 was how cold it was, despite the desert heat outside and the air conditioning unit that looked like it hadn't worked properly in years. Emma immediately complained that it felt weird in there, but Tyler was just excited to have his own TV remote for once. The room itself was standard motel fare: 2 double beds with those scratchy floral bedspreads, a small table, and a TV bolted to the dresser. Everything smelled faintly of cigarettes and industrial cleaning products. We got the kids settled in their room and went through our usual road trip routine. Everyone shower, brush teeth, lay out clothes for tomorrow, that sort of thing. I remember Tyler being particularly wound up that night, bouncing on the beds and talking non-stop about all the cool stuff we'd seen that day. Emma was on her phone trying to get a decent signal, frustrated that she couldn't post any of her road trip photos to Instagram. Around 10 o'clock, we told the kids it was time for lights out. Jameson and I went into our room, leaving the connecting door open just a crack so we could hear if they needed anything. We were both exhausted and fell asleep pretty quickly. But I woke up around 2 in the morning to the sound of the TV in the kids' room turning on. At first, I figured one of them had gotten up to use the bathroom and accidentally hit the remote or something. But when I listened more carefully, I realized the TV wasn't on a normal channel. It was just static, that loud white noise that old TVs make when they're not tuned to anything. I waited a few minutes to see if one of them would turn it off, but the static just kept going. I got up and peeked through the connecting door. Both kids were sound asleep, and the TV remote was sitting on the nightstand between their beds, nowhere near either of them. The TV screen was showing nothing but snow, that black and white static pattern. But the weird thing was that I could swear I heard voices mixed in with the static. Not clear voices, more like people talking very far away or underwater. I walked over and turned the TV off manually, then went back to bed. But about 20 minutes later, it turned on again. Same thing. Pure static, same distant voices. This time I unplugged the whole unit from the wall before going back to our room. I didn't want to wake up the kids by moving them to our room over something that was probably just an electrical problem. The next morning, both Emma and Tyler complained that they'd had weird dreams about people talking to them, but they couldn't remember what the voices had said. Tyler mentioned that he'd had a dream about a little girl who wanted to play with him, and Emma said she'd dreamed about someone asking her for help over and over again. I didn't mention the TV incident because I didn't want to freak them out. And honestly, I was hoping it had just been a fluke. We spent the day exploring some tourist attractions in the area, and by evening, we were all tired enough that I thought everyone would sleep soundly. But that second night was when things really escalated. Again, around 2 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of the TV turning on in the kids' room. This time, though, I could definitely hear voices coming through the static. Multiple voices, adults and children, all talking at once, but too faint to make out individual words. When I went to check on the kids, I found something that made my heart stop. Tyler was sitting up in bed, wide awake, having a conversation with someone. But there was no one else in the room. He was looking toward the corner near the window and responding to questions like someone was asking him about his family, where we were traveling, how long we were staying. When I asked him who he was talking to, he looked confused and said, "The people on the TV." But the TV was showing nothing but static. That's when I noticed other things. The temperature in the room had dropped significantly. I could actually see my breath when I exhaled. The curtains were moving slightly, even though there was no air circulation in the room and the windows were sealed shut. Most disturbing of all, I could see what looked like handprints appearing on the mirror above the dresser, as if invisible people were pressing their palms against it from the other side. I woke up Jameson immediately and told him we were leaving. He started to argue that it was the middle of the night and we'd already paid for the room. But when he saw Tyler still having his conversation with invisible people and the handprints multiplying on the mirror, he didn't need any more convincing. We packed our stuff in about 10 minutes, got the kids dressed, and loaded everything into the car. Tyler cried the whole time we were packing, saying the people didn't want him to leave and that they were lonely. Emma kept asking why the room was so cold and why her phone battery had drained completely overnight, even though she'd plugged it into charge. The third night was supposed to be our last night at Desert Winds. We'd booked 3 nights because the rate was so cheap, and we'd planned to use it as a base for exploring the area. But after what happened the second night, we drove until we found a Hampton Inn about 40 miles down the road. Even though it cost twice as much and we lost the money we'd already paid for the third night at Desert Winds, I didn't care. I just wanted my family somewhere safe. But here's the thing that still gives me chills. We couldn't get completely away from whatever was in that room. For the next 3 nights, no matter which hotel we stayed at, Tyler would wake up around 2 in the morning and start having conversations with people who weren't there. He'd tell me about the nice people who missed their families and wanted to know about his family. Emma started having nightmares about being trapped in small, cold rooms with people she couldn't quite see. It took almost a week before the kids went back to sleeping normally. And even now, 3 years later, if we're staying in any kind of roadside motel, Tyler will ask me if the people are going to visit him again. I did some research when we got home, and I found out that Desert Winds Motel has a reputation for paranormal activity, particularly in rooms 236, 237, and 238. According to local folklore, a family died in a car accident right in front of the motel back in the 1970s, and guests frequently report encounters with spirits in those specific rooms. The local paranormal investigation group has documented dozens of similar experiences over the years. What bothers me most is that the desk clerk clearly knew something was wrong with room 237. That hesitation when he handed me the key, the way he almost seemed to want to warn me about something but didn't. I understand that motels need to rent their rooms to stay in business. But putting families with young children in a room with that kind of activity feels irresponsible at best. We still take family road trips, but now I research every place we stay beforehand. And I always pack extra batteries for everything, because apparently whatever was in that room had a particular appetite for draining electronic devices. The kids joke about it now, calling it our ghost motel adventure. But I know they were genuinely frightened by what they experienced. Sometimes the most innocent family vacation can turn into something you'll never forget, and not in a good way. That was Priscilla's encounter at the Desert Winds Motel, a place where the spirits of tragedy seem to linger in the static between television channels. Let's move to our third story. And this one comes from Evander, a software engineer from Boston who experienced something that completely shattered his rational, scientific worldview. What happened to him and his girlfriend during what was supposed to be a romantic anniversary getaway at a converted lighthouse inn in Maine still defies every logical explanation he's tried to come up with. Here's Evander's account in his own words. I'm the kind of person who has a logical explanation for everything. I work in tech, I believe in data and evidence, and I've always been pretty skeptical of anything supernatural. My girlfriend Kinley used to tease me about being too analytical, always trying to solve mysteries instead of just enjoying them. So when she suggested we spend our 2-year anniversary at this romantic lighthouse inn she'd found on Airbnb, I was all for it. But mainly because of the engineering marvel of converting a historic lighthouse into a bed and breakfast, not because I expected any kind of mystical experience. The Keeper's Inn is located on a rocky outcrop about 30 minutes north of Bar Harbor, Maine. It's this beautiful white lighthouse that was built in 1847 and decommissioned by the Coast Guard in 1962 when they automated the navigation systems in that area. The current owners, an older couple named the Morrisons, bought it in 1998 and spent 5 years converting it into a unique lodging experience. The lighthouse keeper's quarters had been transformed into a cozy two-bedroom suite, complete with a kitchen, living area, and this incredible circular staircase that led up to what used to be the lamp room. Kinley had booked us the lighthouse suite for 3 nights in October 2020. We'd been stuck at home for months because of the pandemic. And this was our first real getaway together since everything had shut down. The drive up from Boston was gorgeous, peak foliage season in New England, and we were both so excited to just disconnect from work and spend some quality time together. When we arrived on Friday afternoon, Mrs. Morrison gave us the full tour. She explained that the lighthouse had guided ships safely to harbor for over a century before being retired, and that they'd tried to preserve as much of the original structure as possible during the renovation. The lamp room at the top had been converted into a reading nook with 360-degree windows offering incredible views of the Atlantic Ocean. She mentioned that the original Fresnel lens had been removed and donated to a maritime museum, but they'd installed period-appropriate furniture and even some vintage nautical equipment for atmosphere. What struck me most during the tour was how Mrs. Morrison kept emphasizing that the lighthouse beacon was completely inactive and had been for almost 60 years. She mentioned this several times, almost like she was trying to make sure we understood that if we saw any lights coming from the lighthouse, it definitely wasn't supposed to be happening. At the time, I thought it was just her way of managing expectations. Maybe guests sometimes complained about not getting the full lighthouse experience. The first 2 nights were absolutely perfect. We cooked dinner together in the little kitchen, spent hours up in the lamp room reading and watching ships pass by in the distance, and just enjoyed being completely disconnected from the outside world. The cell service was practically non-existent, which was actually refreshing. We played board games, talked for hours about everything and nothing, and felt more connected as a couple than we had in months. But on Sunday night, our last night there, something happened that I still can't explain, no matter how many different angles I've approached it from. We'd gone to bed around 11:30, both exhausted from a long day of hiking along the rocky coastline. The bedroom was on the 2nd floor of the keeper's quarters, with windows facing inland, so we couldn't see the lamp room from where we slept. I woke up at exactly 3:17 a.m. I know the exact time because I checked my phone, thinking maybe Kinley's alarm had gone off early or something. But Kinley was sound asleep next to me, and there was no alarm. What had woken me up was this low, rhythmic humming sound, almost mechanical, like heavy machinery starting up after being dormant for a long time. At first, I thought maybe it was a boat engine or some kind of generator kicking on, but the sound seemed to be coming from directly above us. I lay there listening for a few minutes, trying to identify what it could be, when I noticed something that made me sit up in bed. There was light filtering through the curtains, not sunlight, but a bright white light that seemed to be sweeping across the windows in a regular pattern. I got up and looked outside, and what I saw made absolutely no sense. The lighthouse beacon was operating. Not just a light bulb someone had turned on, but the full rotating beacon system, casting its beam across the ocean in the classic lighthouse pattern. A bright white light that swept across the water every 10 seconds, just like it would have done when the lighthouse was active. I stood there watching for probably 5 minutes, trying to figure out what was happening. This wasn't some modern LED setup or decorative lighting. This was the full-intensity maritime beacon, bright enough to be visible for miles out at sea. The beam would sweep across our windows, illuminate the entire rocky coastline, disappear as it rotated away, then come back 10 seconds later. I woke Kinley up because I needed someone else to confirm what I was seeing. At first, she was annoyed that I'd disturbed her sleep. But when she saw the light sweeping across the room every 10 seconds, she became as confused as I was. We both went up to the lamp room to get a better view. And that's when things got really strange. From the lamp room windows, we had a clear view of the lighthouse beacon mechanism directly above us. The light source appeared to be exactly where the original Fresnel lens would have been, and it was definitely rotating on the original mechanical system. But here's what made no sense. We could see the mechanical apparatus turning. We could hear the motors running. But there was no electrical equipment up there. The lamp room we were standing in was completely empty except for the furniture the Morrisons had put in. Kinley suggested that maybe the Morrisons had installed some kind of hidden lighting system as a surprise for guests, but I couldn't see any way that was possible. The beam was too bright, too focused, and too authentic. Plus, the mechanical sounds we were hearing weren't coming from modern motors. They had that heavy, industrial quality of equipment from the 1940s or 1950s. We watched for about 20 minutes, and the beacon never wavered. Every 10 seconds, like clockwork, that bright white light swept across the ocean. But then something else started happening that made the situation even more bizarre. We began hearing what sounded like radio transmissions coming from somewhere in the lighthouse structure. Faint at first, but gradually getting clearer. It was maritime radio traffic, ship-to-shore communications using the old format and terminology that would have been standard in the 1940s and 1950s. We could hear captains reporting their positions, requesting permission to enter harbor, and communicating with what sounded like a lighthouse keeper, responding from our exact location. The voice of the lighthouse keeper was particularly clear, and he was giving navigation instructions and weather updates as if the lighthouse was fully operational. What made this especially unsettling was that the keeper's voice seemed to be coming from the lamp room where we were standing. At one point, we heard him respond to a ship captain's request for current conditions, and his voice was so close, it felt like he was standing right next to us. But there was no one there. Just Kinley and me in this empty room with vintage furniture. The radio transmissions continued for another 10 minutes, and I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The ships that were communicating with our lighthouse keeper were reporting positions and routes that would have been impossible for modern vessels. They were talking about navigation hazards that no longer existed, referring to wartime blackout procedures, and using call signs that maritime historians would recognize as being from World War II era. Around 4:15 a.m., everything stopped at once. The beacon light went out, the mechanical humming ceased, and the radio transmissions cut off mid-sentence. We were left standing in complete darkness and silence, with just the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below. When we checked our phones, both of our batteries had drained completely, even though they'd been fully charged when we went to bed. The next morning, we asked Mrs. Morrison about what we'd experienced. She didn't seem surprised, but she also didn't seem comfortable discussing it. She mentioned that other guests had reported similar incidents, always on the third night of their stay, and always at exactly 3:17 a.m. She told us that local maritime records showed that the lighthouse had suffered a tragic accident in March 1943, when the lighthouse keeper and his assistant were killed during a severe storm while trying to maintain the beacon for a convoy of ships that were seeking safe harbor. According to the historical records Mrs. Morrison showed us, the lighthouse keeper, Thomas Whitmore, had stayed at his post despite increasingly dangerous conditions because several ships were depending on the beacon to navigate safely through the storm. The lighthouse continued operating that night, even after Whitmore and his assistant were found dead at their posts the next morning, leading to speculation that their dedication to saving lives had somehow transcended death itself. Mrs. Morrison explained that the lighthouse had been unusually active during World War II, serving as a crucial navigation point for military and merchant vessels. The radio equipment we'd heard was consistent with the communication setup that would have been standard during that era, and the ship communications we'd intercepted matched the types of vessels that would have been seeking guidance from that lighthouse during wartime convoys. What I still can't reconcile with my logical, scientific mind is how we witnessed a fully operational lighthouse beacon system with no electrical infrastructure to support it. I've researched lighthouse technology extensively since that night, and there's simply no way to produce that type of intense, focused light beam without significant electrical equipment and a properly maintained lens system. Yet we saw it operating exactly as it would have in 1943, complete with the original mechanical rotation system. Kinley and I still talk about that night regularly, and we've never been able to come up with a rational explanation for what we experienced. We've stayed at dozens of unique properties since then, but nothing has ever come close to the intensity of that encounter at the Keeper's Inn. Sometimes I wonder if Thomas Whitmore is still at his post, still guiding ships safely to harbor, still doing his duty even 60 years after his death. And if that's true, then maybe there are some things that are more important than logic and scientific explanation. That was Evander's encounter at the Keeper's Inn, where the lighthouse keeper's dedication seems to transcend the boundaries between life and death. Let's move to our fourth story, and this one comes from Connor, a professional wedding photographer from Clover, North Carolina, who discovered that sometimes the camera captures more than what the human eye can see. What happened to him during a wedding shoot at a converted plantation resort in South Carolina left him with photographic evidence of something that shouldn't exist. Here's Connor's account, in his own words. I've been shooting weddings professionally for about 8 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything. Bridezillas, drunk groomsmen, family drama, equipment failures, you name it. I pride myself on being prepared for any situation and capturing those perfect moments that couples will treasure for the rest of their lives. But what happened to me at Magnolia Grove Plantation Resort in August 2022 shook me so badly that I almost quit photography altogether. The wedding was for this lovely couple, Jessica and Michael, who'd booked me about a year in advance. They wanted a classic Southern plantation wedding, complete with the antebellum mansion, sprawling oak trees draped in Spanish moss, and all the romantic atmosphere that comes with that setting. Magnolia Grove was perfect for what they had in mind. It's this beautifully restored 1840s plantation house that's been converted into a luxury wedding venue and boutique hotel about an hour outside of Charleston. I arrived on Friday afternoon to do my usual venue walkthrough and lighting tests. The property was stunning, exactly the kind of place that photographs beautifully. The main house had been meticulously restored, with original hardwood floors, period furnishings, and these incredible floor-to-ceiling windows that let in gorgeous natural light. The grounds featured formal gardens, a pond with a gazebo, and those magnificent oak trees that must have been there for centuries. The venue coordinator, a woman named Patricia, gave me the full tour and explained the timeline for Saturday's events. The ceremony would be held on the front lawn under the oak trees, cocktail hour in the gardens, and the reception in the mansion's grand ballroom. She mentioned that I'd have access to all areas of the property for photos, including the second and third floors of the mansion, which had been converted into guest suites for the wedding party. What struck me during the tour was how Patricia kept emphasizing the historical significance of the property. She talked about the original family who'd built the plantation, the architectural details that had been preserved, and the careful research that had gone into the restoration. But I noticed she was very vague about the actual history of the place. Who had lived there? What had happened during the Civil War? That sort of thing. When I asked specific questions about the plantation's past, She'd redirect the conversation to the amenities or the logistics for the wedding. Friday evening, I stayed in one of the guest suites on the second floor of the mansion. The room was beautiful. 4-poster bed, antique furniture, and windows overlooking the front lawn where the ceremony would take place. I spent the evening reviewing my shot list and charging all my equipment. Everything seemed perfect for what should have been a straightforward, albeit elegant, wedding shoot. Saturday morning started early with getting ready photos of the bride and her bridesmaids. Jessica had booked the bridal suite on the 3rd floor, which was this gorgeous room with a sitting area, vanity, and these amazing windows that provided beautiful natural light for detail shots of the dress, rings, and bouquet. The bridesmaids were having a great time, sipping mimosas and helping Jessica with her final preparations. I was shooting with my usual setup. 2 camera bodies, one with a 24 to 70 millimeter lens and one with an 85 millimeter prime for portraits. I always shoot in RAW format so I have maximum flexibility in post-processing, and I typically bracket my exposures to ensure I capture all the details in challenging lighting situations. The ceremony went off without a hitch. The lighting under the oak trees was perfect, the couple looked radiant, and I captured some really beautiful moments during the exchange of vows and rings. During the cocktail hour, I moved around the gardens getting candid shots of guests mingling, the couple with family members, and those classic detail shots of the reception setup. It wasn't until I was editing the photos Sunday evening that I noticed something strange. In several of the shots I'd taken during the cocktail hour, there were people in the background who hadn't been at the wedding. At first, I thought maybe they were staff members or other guests I hadn't noticed. But when I looked more carefully, these figures were dressed in clothing that was completely out of place for a modern wedding. In one photo of the bride and groom near the gazebo, there was clearly a woman in the background wearing what looked like a full-length dress from the 1850s, complete with a bonnet and shawl. In another shot of the wedding party on the front steps of the mansion, I could see several people in period clothing standing in the doorway behind them. Men in formal suits with high collars, and women in long dresses with full skirts. What made this particularly unsettling was that these weren't blurry or indistinct figures. They were crystal clear, well lit, and perfectly in focus. If I hadn't been there personally and known exactly who was supposed to be in each shot, I would have assumed these were reenactors or historical interpreters who were part of the venue's ambiance. I went through every photo from the reception, and the pattern continued. In the ballroom shots, there were additional guests sitting at tables that had been empty during the actual event. These figures were all dressed in clothing consistent with the mid-1800s, and they appeared to be participating in the celebration, raising glasses, talking to each other, even seeming to watch the couple during their first dance. The most disturbing photo was one I'd taken of the bride throwing her bouquet. In the background, clearly visible through the mansion's front windows, was what appeared to be a group of people in period dress watching the festivities from inside the house. But I knew for certain that no one had been in the front parlor during the bouquet toss. All the guests were outside on the lawn. I thought maybe there was something wrong with my camera or that I'd accidentally double-exposed some film. But I shoot digital, and each image file had normal metadata showing it was a single exposure. Plus, the lighting and shadows on these mysterious figures were completely consistent with the actual lighting conditions at the time I took each shot. I decided to call Patricia to ask about the history of the plantation and whether they ever had historical reenactors on the property. That's when she finally opened up about what I'd probably captured in my photos. She told me that Magnolia Grove had a long and complex history, including the fact that over 200 enslaved people had lived and worked there before the Civil War. Patricia explained that the current owners were very sensitive about this history and preferred not to discuss it with wedding clients, because they wanted to focus on creating beautiful, positive memories rather than dwelling on the painful aspects of the property's past. But she admitted that wedding photographers weren't the first to capture unexplained figures in their photos, and that several guests over the years had reported seeing people in period clothing around the property. She mentioned that the plantation had been abandoned for several decades in the early 1900s, before being purchased and restored in the 1990s. During the restoration, workers had found personal belongings, letters, and other artifacts that suggested the property had been home to multiple generations of families, both the enslaving family and the enslaved community. What Patricia told me next made me understand why these figures might be appearing in photographs. According to local historians, Magnolia Grove had been not just a working plantation, but also a gathering place for the surrounding community. The mansion had hosted weddings, celebrations, and social events for decades, bringing together people from across the region for important life milestones. The theory that made the most sense to me was that the emotional resonance of weddings and celebrations somehow triggered these manifestations. The joy and significance of Jessica and Michael's wedding day might have awakened memories of similar celebrations that had taken place on the same grounds over 150 years ago. I spent weeks researching the plantation's history, looking through historical records, census data, and newspaper archives from the 1800s. What I found was fascinating and heartbreaking. There were records of multiple weddings held at Magnolia Grove, both for the plantation owner's family and for members of the enslaved community who lived there. One newspaper account from 1852 described an elaborate wedding reception held at the mansion for the plantation owner's daughter, with guests traveling from across South Carolina to attend. Another document I found was a diary entry from a visitor who described attending a wedding celebration in the slave quarters, noting the music, dancing, and joy despite the circumstances. When I compared the clothing and appearance of the figures in my photographs to historical images from that period, the consistency was remarkable. The women's dresses, the men's formal wear, even the hairstyles all matched what people would have worn to special occasions in the 1850s. I ultimately decided to share a few of the photos with Jessica and Michael, though I was careful about how I presented them. They were initially skeptical, but when they saw the clear, undeniable presence of people who hadn't been at their wedding, they became as fascinated as I was. Jessica actually found it comforting to think that their wedding had somehow honored the memory of all the couples who had celebrated at Magnolia Grove over the years. I've shot several weddings at historic venues since then, but I've never captured anything similar. Part of me wonders if the emotional intensity of that particular day, the joy of Jessica and Michael's celebration combined with the profound history of the plantation, created the perfect conditions for these manifestations to be visible to my camera. The experience changed how I approach wedding photography at historic venues. I'm more aware now of the layers of history that exist in these spaces, and I have a deeper appreciation for the fact that when couples choose to celebrate at places like Magnolia Grove, they're not just creating their own memories. They're participating in a continuation of human celebration that spans generations. That was Connor's encounter at Magnolia Grove Plantation, where the joy of one wedding seemed to awaken the celebrations of the past. Let's move to our fifth story. And this one comes from Nelson, an avid hiker and outdoor enthusiast from Denver, Colorado, who thought he knew everything there was to know about mountain safety and weather conditions. What he experienced during a solo retreat at a remote ski lodge in February 2023 taught him that some dangers in the mountains aren't natural at all. Here's Nelson's account, in his own words. I've been hiking and climbing in the Colorado Rockies for over 12 years, and I consider myself pretty experienced when it comes to mountain conditions, weather patterns, and outdoor safety. I'm the kind of person who checks avalanche reports religiously, carries emergency beacons, and always tells someone my exact route and expected return time. So when I decided to book a solo retreat at Whispering Pines Lodge for a long weekend in February, I thought I was just treating myself to some peaceful mountain time and maybe some cross-country skiing. Whispering Pines Lodge is located about 40 minutes outside of Vail, accessible only by a winding mountain road that gets pretty treacherous in winter conditions. It's one of those classic Colorado mountain lodges that was built in the 1920s as a private retreat for some wealthy Denver family, then converted to a small boutique hotel in the 1980s. The place only has 8 guest rooms, and they market it as a disconnect to reconnect experience. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just you and the mountains. I'd been working insane hours at my engineering firm for months, and I was honestly burnt out. My girlfriend had been suggesting I take some time off, but I kept putting it off until she basically booked the lodge for me as a Valentine's Day present. She knew I'd been wanting to try some backcountry skiing in that area, and the lodge offered equipment rentals and access to several unmarked trails that were perfect for intermediate skiers. I arrived on Friday afternoon during what the weather service was calling a moderate snow event, basically steady snowfall that was expected to drop about 6 to 8 inches overnight. Perfect skiing conditions, and I was looking forward to having the trails mostly to myself. The lodge manager, an older guy named Pete, checked me in and gave me the standard briefing about meal times, the honor system bar, and the trail maps. He mentioned that I was one of only 3 guests that weekend because of the weather forecast, which was exactly what I'd hoped for. My room was on the 2nd floor with a view of the main ski trail that wound down from the ridge behind the lodge. It was exactly the kind of rustic mountain accommodation I'd expected. Log walls, a stone fireplace, and furniture that looked like it had been there since the lodge opened. The only modern touches were the updated bathroom and electric heating, though Pete mentioned they still used the original wood-burning fireplace in the main lobby. Friday evening was perfect. I had dinner with the other 2 guests, a couple from Texas who were celebrating their anniversary, and we spent a few hours in the lobby playing cards and sharing hiking stories. The snowfall was steady but not heavy, and everything felt exactly like the peaceful mountain getaway I'd been craving. I went to bed around 10:30, planning to get up early for a full day of skiing. I woke up around 2:30 a.m. to what sounded like voices calling out in the distance. At first, I thought maybe it was the couple from Texas having some kind of emergency, but when I listened more carefully, the voices seemed to be coming from outside, somewhere up on the mountain. I got up and looked out my window, but all I could see was snow falling steadily through the darkness. The voices were faint but persistent, and they seemed to be calling for help. Now, as someone who's done a lot of mountain rescue training, I know that people get lost or injured in the backcountry all the time, especially during snowstorms. My first instinct was to alert Pete and see if we needed to call search and rescue, even though the lack of cell service would make that complicated. I got dressed and went downstairs to find Pete, but the lobby was empty and his office was locked. I could still hear the voices, though they seemed to be getting more distant. I went back to my room and tried to pinpoint exactly where the sounds were coming from. Based on the direction and the way sound travels in mountain terrain, it seemed like the voices were coming from somewhere up the main ski trail, probably a mile or 2 into the backcountry. The next morning at breakfast, I mentioned the voices to Pete and asked if he'd heard anything or if there were any reports of missing hikers in the area. He looked uncomfortable and said he hadn't heard anything, but he'd check with the local authorities when he went into town for supplies later that day. The couple from Texas hadn't heard anything either, which I found strange since their room was on the same side of the lodge as mine. I decided to go skiing anyway, figuring that if someone had been in distress the night before, either they'd been found or the situation was beyond what I could help with. I took the main trail up toward the ridge, following the route I'd heard the voices coming from. The snow conditions were absolutely perfect. Fresh powder, good visibility, and that incredible silence you only get in the mountains after a snowfall. About 2 miles up the trail, I came across something that made me stop cold. There were tracks in the snow that looked like they'd been made by multiple people walking in single file. But the weird thing was that the tracks looked old, like they'd been made before the snowfall the night before, then partially filled in. But that was impossible, because the snow had been falling steadily for over 12 hours, and any tracks made before that would have been completely covered. The tracks led off the main trail toward a steep section of the mountain that I knew had significant avalanche danger. According to the trail map, that area had been closed to recreational use since the early 1990s after a series of slides that had claimed several lives. There were warning signs posted, and the trail itself was blocked off with barriers and hazard tape. But these tracks went right past the barriers and continued up toward the avalanche zone. I followed them for about 50 yards, trying to figure out what I was seeing. The footprints were clear enough that I could tell they'd been made by people wearing older-style snowshoes or boots, not modern hiking gear. Some of the prints were smaller, like they'd been made by children or teenagers. That's when I heard the voices again. Even though it was the middle of the afternoon, they were coming from somewhere higher up the mountain, in the direction the tracks were leading. The voices sounded urgent, almost panicked, and I could make out individual words now. Help us. We're lost, can't find the way down. The strange thing was that the voices had an odd quality to them, like they were coming from very far away or through some kind of barrier. I knew I shouldn't follow the tracks into the avalanche zone, but something about those voices compelled me to at least try to help. I had my avalanche beacon, probe, and shovel, plus emergency supplies, so I felt reasonably safe to investigate a little further. I called out several times, identifying myself and asking if anyone needed assistance. But I never got a direct response, just those same distant voices calling for help. I followed the tracks for another quarter mile, climbing steadily toward a narrow canyon that I recognized from topographic maps as being particularly dangerous for avalanches. The voices were getting clearer, and I started to hear other sounds too. People talking to each other, what sounded like equipment being moved around, even some crying or sobbing. That's when I noticed something that made me question everything I was experiencing. The tracks I'd been following weren't just partially filled with snow. They were disappearing and reappearing as I watched. In some sections, I could see clear boot prints in the snow. But in other sections, the snow was completely undisturbed, as if no one had walked there at all. I stopped and took out my phone to document what I was seeing, even though there was no signal to send the photos anywhere. Through my camera screen, I could see the tracks clearly. But when I looked up from the phone, sections of the trail appeared empty. It was like the tracks only existed in certain lighting conditions or from certain angles. The voices were becoming more distinct now, and I could hear what sounded like a group of people having a conversation about being lost and trying to find shelter. Someone was talking about the temperature dropping and worrying about hypothermia. Another voice, sounding younger, was asking about when they'd be able to go home. I realized I was listening to what sounded like a search and rescue situation. But there was no one there. No people, no emergency vehicles, no helicopter sounds. Just these voices that seemed to be coming from the mountain itself. That's when I remembered Pete's uncomfortable expression when I'd mentioned hearing voices, and I started to think about the history of this area. I'd read about avalanche accidents in Colorado, But I'd never researched the specific incidents that had led to the closure of this particular section of the mountain. I decided to turn around and head back to the lodge, but the voices followed me. For the entire ski back down the trail, I could hear people calling for help, asking for directions, and talking about being cold and scared. The strangest part was that the voices seemed to be responding to my presence. When I called out that I was going to get help, I heard someone say thank you very clearly. When I stopped to check my map, I heard someone ask if I knew the way back to the lodge. When I got back to Whispering Pines, Pete was waiting for me in the lobby. Before I could say anything, he asked if I'd heard the voices again. When I said yes, he sat me down and explained what I'd probably experienced. In March 1994, a group of 8 people, 3 families with children, had been caught in an unexpected avalanche while skiing in exactly the area where I'd heard the voices. The group had been staying at Whispering Pines Lodge and had decided to explore some of the backcountry trails despite warnings about unstable snow conditions. They'd been reported missing when they failed to return for dinner, and search and rescue teams had found their bodies 2 days later, buried under 15 feet of snow and debris. Pete told me that guests had been reporting voices in that area for almost 30 years, always during or after snowstorms, and always describing the same sounds. People calling for help, talking about being lost, asking for directions back to the lodge. The voices were most commonly heard by experienced hikers and skiers, people who would naturally respond to calls for help in the mountains. According to Pete, several guests over the years had followed the voices up into the avalanche zone, just like I had. Most of them described seeing tracks that appeared and disappeared, and hearing conversations that seemed to be happening in real time. Some had even reported seeing figures in the distance, but the figures always disappeared when approached. The local authorities were aware of the reports, but there was no official explanation for what people were experiencing. The area remained closed to recreational use, and the lodge now included information about the 1994 avalanche in their safety briefings. Though Pete admitted they didn't always mention the ongoing voice phenomena because it tended to frighten guests. What struck me most about Pete's explanation was how specific the voices had been. The conversations I'd heard about being lost, needing shelter, worrying about the cold, matched exactly what that group of families would have been experiencing during their final hours on the mountain. It was as if their last desperate attempts to find safety were somehow still echoing in that place, triggered by weather conditions similar to what they'd faced. I've been back to Colorado many times since then, but I've never returned to Whispering Pines Lodge. The experience didn't frighten me exactly, but it gave me a profound respect for the fact that mountains hold memories of everyone who's ever been lost in them. Sometimes, when I'm out on a difficult trail or in challenging weather, I think about those 8 people who just wanted to enjoy a day of skiing with their families. And I'm reminded that the mountains don't always let go of the people they claim. That was Nelson's encounter at Whispering Pines Lodge, where the mountains seem to hold the voices of those who never made it home. Let's move to our 6th story. And this one comes from David Kim, a hotel night manager who's worked in the hospitality industry for over 15 years. What he experienced during a routine renovation period at a downtown Chicago hotel challenged everything he thought he knew about guest complaints and security protocols. Here's David's account in his own words. I've been working night shifts at hotels for most of my career, and I thought I'd heard every possible guest complaint you could imagine. Noise from upstairs, air conditioning problems, suspicious smells, you name it. When you work the graveyard shift at a busy downtown property, you become the go-to person for every weird situation that happens between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. But what happened at the Metropolitan Grand Chicago during the summer of 2022 was unlike anything I'd encountered in 15 years of hotel management. I'd been the night manager at the Metropolitan Grand for about 3 years when corporate decided to do a major renovation of the 14th floor. This was a big project, completely gutting the guest rooms, updating the plumbing and electrical systems, installing new windows, the works. The entire floor had been closed to guests since early June, and we had construction crews working during the day shift to minimize noise complaints from other floors. The renovation was supposed to take about 4 months, and we'd had to relocate several regular business travelers who always requested rooms on 14 because of the quieter atmosphere and better city views. As night manager, part of my job was handling any issues related to the construction, securing the floor after the workers left, dealing with noise complaints from adjacent floors, and making sure our security protocols were being followed. Everything was routine for the first few weeks. The construction crews would finish up around 5 p.m. I'd do a walkthrough of the 14th floor during my evening rounds to make sure everything was properly secured, and we'd repeat the process the next day. The floor was completely empty. No furniture, no guests, no staff except for the construction workers during the day. That's why I was so confused when I started getting guest complaints about the 14th floor in late July. The first complaint came from Mrs. Patterson in room 1312, directly below the construction area. She called the front desk around midnight on a Tuesday, reporting that someone in the room above her was crying loudly and wouldn't stop. She was polite but firm about needing the noise to stop because she had an important presentation the next morning. I explained to Mrs. Patterson that the entire 14th floor was under renovation and completely unoccupied. But she insisted that she could hear a woman crying in room 1412, which was directly above hers. To satisfy the guest, I went up to 14 and used my master key to check room 1412. The room was completely gutted. No flooring, exposed walls, construction equipment everywhere. Definitely no one there, and certainly no one who could be making noise that would carry to the floor below. I went back and explained the situation to Mrs. Patterson, suggesting that maybe the sound was coming from another room, or perhaps from outside the building. She seemed satisfied with my explanation, but she called again an hour later with the same complaint. This time she was more agitated, saying the crying had gotten louder and was now accompanied by what sounded like someone walking back and forth. I did another check of the 14th floor, this time being more thorough. I checked every single room, the hallways, the stairwells, even the utility closets. Everything was empty and secure, exactly as I'd left it during my evening rounds. I also checked the guest registry to make sure there hadn't been some mistake with room assignments. But there were no guests listed for any 14th floor rooms. Over the next few nights, the complaints started coming from other guests on the 13th and 15th floors. Room 1315 reported hearing sobbing and footsteps from above. Room 1520 complained about a woman crying somewhere nearby. Room 1318 called to say they could hear someone having what sounded like a phone conversation, though they couldn't make out the words clearly. What made these complaints particularly frustrating was their consistency. Every single guest described hearing a woman crying, usually between midnight and 3 a.m., and most of them also mentioned footsteps or movement sounds. They all pinpointed the source as coming from the 14th floor, even though I was checking that floor multiple times per night and finding it completely empty. After a week of these complaints, I decided to involve our security team. We have cameras in all the main hallways, and I asked our head of security, Mike, to review the footage from the 14th floor to see if somehow someone was getting access to the construction area. The cameras showed exactly what I expected. Nothing. No people, no movement, just empty hallways lit by emergency lighting. But Mike pointed out something interesting in the footage. On several nights when we'd received complaints about crying, There were anomalies in the camera feeds from the 14th floor. The image would flicker or go briefly to static, always around the same times that guests were calling to complain about noise. It wasn't enough to indicate equipment malfunction, but it was unusual enough to be noticeable. I started spending more of my shift on the 14th floor, doing extended rounds and even sitting in the hallway for periods to see if I could hear whatever the guests were reporting. For about 2 weeks, I never heard anything unusual. The floor was eerily quiet, which made sense given that it was basically a construction zone with no guests, no carpeting to muffle sound, and no activity. Then, on a Thursday night, in mid-August, I finally heard it myself. I was doing my 1 a.m. security check of the 14th floor when I heard what sounded like muffled sobbing coming from the direction of room 1420. It wasn't loud, but in the complete silence of the empty floor, it was clearly audible. The sound would start and stop, like someone trying to cry quietly, but occasionally losing control. I walked toward room 1420, and the sound seemed to move. As I got closer to 1420, the crying appeared to shift to 1418, then to 1416. It was like whatever was making the noise was staying just ahead of me as I moved down the hallway. I unlocked each room as I passed it, checking inside. But every room was empty and silent. The crying continued for about 20 minutes, then stopped abruptly. I stood in the hallway for another 30 minutes, but there was no further sound. When I checked with the front desk, we'd received 3 guest complaints during that exact time period, all reporting crying from the 14th floor. I decided to review our hotel's history to see if there might be some explanation for what guests were experiencing. The Metropolitan Grand had been built in 1987, so it didn't have the kind of tragic historical events you might associate with older hotels. But when I dug into the employee records and incident reports, I found something that made me reconsider the situation. In November 2019, we'd had a guest death on the 14th floor. A woman named Jennifer Walsh, who'd been staying in room 1418 for what appeared to be a business trip, had been found deceased in her room by housekeeping. The official cause of death was listed as suicide, and the police report indicated that she'd been going through a difficult divorce and had lost custody of her children earlier that year. What struck me about Jennifer's case was the timing. According to the incident reports, other guests had complained about hearing crying and distressed voices from her room for 2 nights before housekeeping found her body. The report suggested that she'd been in emotional distress for several days before her death, and that the crying sounds had been audible to neighboring guests. I cross-referenced the room numbers where we'd been getting complaints with Jennifer's room location, and there was a clear pattern. Room 1418, where Jennifer had died, was at the center of the area where guests consistently reported hearing crying. The complaints were coming from rooms directly above, below, and adjacent to 1418. This discovery made me wonder if the renovation work had somehow triggered whatever residual presence Jennifer had left in that space. Construction involves tearing down walls, exposing structural elements, and essentially disrupting the physical environment where she'd spent her final days. Maybe the process of gutting her room had disturbed something that had been dormant for almost 3 years. I shared my findings with the hotel's general manager, and she agreed to let me bring in some additional monitoring equipment to document what we were experiencing. We set up audio recording devices in several locations on the 14th floor and arranged for me to have backup security coverage so I could spend more time investigating the complaints. Over the next month, I captured several audio recordings of the crying sounds that guests were reporting. The recordings were clear enough to analyze, and what I found was both fascinating and heartbreaking. The crying had a specific pattern. It would start softly, build to more intense sobbing, then fade back to quiet sniffles. It sounded like someone who was trying to control their emotions, but kept being overwhelmed by grief. More disturbing was that the recordings also captured what sounded like one-sided phone conversations. We could hear a woman's voice, though the words weren't always clear, talking about custody arrangements, legal proceedings, and repeatedly saying things like, "I just want to see my kids, and I don't know what to do anymore." The construction foreman mentioned that his crew had been finding personal items during the renovation work in room 1418. Items that housekeeping had apparently missed when the room was cleaned after Jennifer's death. They'd found letters, photographs, and what appeared to be legal documents related to a divorce proceeding, all hidden in places like behind the headboard and inside the heating vents. We ultimately decided to complete the renovation as planned, but we also arranged for a memorial service for Jennifer in our hotel chapel. We contacted her family and learned that she'd never had a proper funeral because of the circumstances of her death and the family's financial situation. Her sister was grateful for the opportunity to have some kind of closure. After the memorial service, the guest complaints stopped almost immediately. We reopened the 14th floor in October 2022, and in the year and a half since then, we've had no reports of unusual sounds or disturbances from that area. Room 1418 is now one of our most requested rooms because of its city views and quiet atmosphere. Looking back on the experience, I think Jennifer was still present in that space, reliving the emotional distress of her final days. The renovation work may have amplified her presence somehow, making her grief audible to sensitive guests on the surrounding floors. Once we acknowledged her death properly and gave her family a chance to say goodbye, she was finally able to find peace. I've worked in hotels long enough to know that these buildings hold a lot of human emotion: joy, sadness, celebration, heartbreak. Most of the time, those emotions fade with time and new memories. But sometimes, when someone's final emotions were particularly intense, they can linger in a space long after the person is gone. My job as a night manager is to ensure all our guests have a comfortable stay. And sometimes that includes the guests who never checked out. That was David's encounter at the Metropolitan Grand, where professional duty led him to help a guest find peace even after death. Let's move to our 7th story. And this one comes from me, Bailey Hart, a field investigator for Pacific Paranormal Research. I've spent the last decade documenting hauntings up and down the West Coast. But what I encountered at Seaview Inn on the Oregon coast still makes me doubt every tidy theory I've ever proposed about residual energy and intelligent spirits. Here's my full account. I first heard the Seaview whispers in the fall of 2022 while combing county archives for repeat incident properties. The inn appeared again and again in police logs. Noise complaints about children running the halls, reports of music boxes playing after the power had been cut during storms, and an extraordinary number of calls from guests insisting they'd heard someone pounding on their door, only to find an empty corridor. Most intriguing was a 1987 entry noting that 2 sheriff's deputies responding to a disturbance left abruptly, citing family emergencies, and never filed a full narrative. Local rumor filled in the gap. The Victorian Seaside Hotel, built in 1893 for railroad tourists, had housed several of the child survivors of the SS Harriet wreck that same year. The children were allegedly sheltered in attic rooms until their relatives could claim them. Many never did. I booked 3 nights in early January 2023, when winter storms batter the Oregon coast and the inn operates at half capacity. I traveled light. A Pelican case with recorders, IR cams, and data loggers. A canvas duffel with clothes, and the leather-bound field journal I've used since grad school. I checked in on a windswept Tuesday afternoon. The desk clerk, a soft-spoken man named Owen, handed me the brass key to room 305 and added, almost apologetically, "If you hear kids after lights out, it's the pipes." They groan. He didn't meet my eyes. Room 305 sat at the far end of the third-floor corridor, directly beneath the attic stairs. Victorian decor can veer into kitsch, but sea views felt authentic. Faded Persian runners, wainscoting the color of sun-bleached driftwood, salt-clouded transom windows. I spent the first evening mapping EMF baselines and noting RF interference from the coastal weather station 3 miles south. By midnight, the inn settled into the deep hush unique to old buildings. You can almost hear the joists sigh with relief as guests finally stop moving. At 1:12 a.m., I set the first audio recorder on the hallway carpet outside my door, hit record, and shut myself inside with a second unit rolling on the dresser. My goal was to capture a clean, control night before any provocations. No EVP questions. No trigger objects. Around 2:45 a.m. I dozed off. I'm a light sleeper, but the next sound still jolted me upright. A single sharp knock, like knuckles on oak, directly above my head. 2 seconds later came another, then a third. The cadence reminded me of a child tentatively tapping for permission to enter. I sat, transfixed until a fourth knock landed, not overhead this time, but from the corridor outside my door. Adrenaline snapped me into field mode. I killed the bedside recorder, grabbed my flashlight and handheld thermal camera, and opened the door. The hall was empty, end to end. Yet the smart temp display on my wrist showed the ambient had nosedived from 64 degrees Fahrenheit to 51 degrees Fahrenheit in less than 30 seconds. I started the corridor recorder playback through earbuds. Faint static, then a warbling tone I couldn't place, followed by a hushed giggle, definitely a child's, and the creak of the attic stairs. The giggle lasted less than a second, but its clarity erased any thoughts of pipe noise. I spent the next hour sweeping the attic with IR and thermal. The space was unfinished, exposed rafters, cedar chip insulation, and a line of 6 narrow servant-style rooms originally meant for seasonal staff. My camera LCD stayed stubbornly blank, except for a cold spot. 40 degrees Fahrenheit versus the attic's 48 degrees Fahrenheit, hovering midway down the corridor. It held steady for 24 seconds, drifted left toward one of the servant doors, and vanished. Day 2, I interviewed staff. Owen repeated that plumbing excuse, but the sous chef, Janessa, was more forthcoming once I bought her coffee. She said housekeepers refused to service room 307 alone after dusk. Several claimed that toys appeared overnight, tin soldiers, jacks, only to disappear by morning. She'd personally seen wet footprints leading from the freight elevator to the attic stairs on a night when every guest had already been accounted for downstairs. That evening, high tide coincided with a gale-force storm. Perfect conditions. I placed a REM pod toy, basically a proximity alarm disguised as a plush bear, on the attic corridor floor and left a voice recorder beside it. At 10:37 p.m., I returned to 305, set up a wide-angle night vision cam facing the door, and spoke one invitation into the darkness. If you need help, you can knock again. I'm listening. Then I waited. Notebook open, pen ready. Nothing. Midnight ticked past. Wind screamed down the chimney. At 12:42 a.m., the hall recorder spiked. 3 rapid knocks, the REM pod bear chirping, and the unmistakable squeal of laughter. This time, multiple voices. On my camera, the hallway light beneath the doorframe flickered as someone, passed in front of the sconce. My doorknob rattled lightly, and a child's voice whispered a single word. Hide. I yanked the door open. Empty hall. REM pod still flashing red 30 feet up. I advanced, filming. Halfway I felt it. A wall of cold, like stepping into a walk-in freezer. My breath fogged. Every hair on my arms lifted. The bear's alarm cut off, and an antique door at the corridor's end groaned open of its own accord. Inside the small servant room, dusty moonlight through a dormer window revealed a wooden trunk. Its lid was slightly ajar. I knelt, filming. The inn shook under a gust, and the lid fell open wider, revealing water-stained children's clothing neatly folded. Pinafores, sailor suits, woolen socks. On top sat a tarnished engraved whistle, the kind a ship's officer might carry. I hadn't touched a thing, yet the whistle rolled sideways and dropped onto the floorboards. My recorder caught a breathy, overlapping chant of childish voices. Found us. Found us. The thermal cam showed nothing, but my skin prickled as if static crawled over it. Back in 305, I cataloged evidence and pulled historical documents. Contemporary newspaper accounts confirmed 11 children rescued from the Harriet wreck were indeed sheltered at Seaview in 1893. 8 were eventually claimed. 3, siblings Clara and Joseph Wentworth and an unnamed boy listed as approximately 6 years, were never matched to family. 2 weeks after the wreck, influenza tore through the coast. Clara and Joseph died in the attic rooms. No record existed for the third boy. The inn changed owners within a year, and guest ledgers from 1894 onward omit any reference to the children. Night 3, final opportunity. I chose room 307, the one cleaners avoided. Brought the whistle as a trigger object, placed it on the nightstand, and spoke aloud. Clara, Joseph, if you remember this, you're safe. You can show me. I set the REM pod bear on the floor again and powered every device I had. The storm had blown inland, leaving the inn in eerie, pressure-dropped calm. For an hour, nothing. Then, at 1:18 a.m., the atmosphere changed. Ears popped. Static charge lifted the hairs on my neck before any sound registered. The whistle emitted a single shrill blast without human lips touching it. Simultaneously, the bear's alarm screamed, and my Geiger counter, brought to detect EM surges, spiked to 5 times baseline. I asked, "Do you want to be found?" The bear's lights blinked twice. In Morse, that's the letter I. Before I could parse that, my recorder captured a soft chorus. He's coming. The temperature plunged. Frost formed on the brass bedposts. Footsteps pounded down the hallway, adult stride, heavy boots. The children's whispers turned frantic. "Hide! Hide!" The door handle twisted as if someone tried to force entry, yet my deadbolt held. I shouted, "Who's out there?" No reply, only relentless pounding that made the wood flex. My night vision cam showed nothing in the hall, but the audio registered deep, wet gasps between impacts, as though the attacker were drowning. Then silence. Absolute. I stepped into the corridor. Dry floorboards, normal temperature. But halfway to the attic stairs, a single set of wet footprints, small, barefoot, appeared on the runner, heading toward the servant rooms. They stopped at the open door where I'd found the trunk. Inside, the whistle lay atop the clothes again, perfectly centered, dry as bone. At dawn, I met Owen at the front desk and placed the whistle between us. His face drained of color. He retrieved a faded photograph from a locked drawer. 2 children in formal nautical attire, flanking a grave-faced young man, clutching that same whistle. Written on the back, Purser Edwin Moore with Wentworth twins. January 10th, 1893. Moore, it turned out, survived the wreck but disappeared during the quarantine period at Seaview. Local legend held he drowned himself after losing the children entrusted to him. Owen admitted staff had tried to enter the children's belongings years ago, but the items always reappeared in the attic. Guests kept hearing playing children, then running from what they called the gasping man. The inn's owners feared publicity. They told staff to blame pipes. Before checkout, I climbed once more to the attic servant room. Morning sun cut through seaside fog, illuminating moats over the trunk. I placed the whistle inside, closed the lid, and spoke. "Edwin, they're with you. You can go." No reply. Yet as I left, the door latched gently behind me, though no breeze passed. 3 months later, a construction crew renovating the seaside retaining wall uncovered skeletal remains of an adult male, waterlogged inside a century-old lifeboat storage locker. Coroner's records listed a brass nameplate stitched into the decayed jacket lining. E. Moore, Purser SS Harriet. The discovery made regional news for a day, framed as historical curiosity. Seaview Inn quietly funded a proper burial for Moore and the Wentworth twins in the Little Bluff Cemetery south of town. Since then, not a single guest complaint about children or pounding has reached county dispatch. I've reviewed my evidence dozens of times. I captured 46 minutes of audio anomalies, 11 temperature drops greater than 10 degrees Fahrenheit within seconds, 1 object manipulation, and a synchronized multi-device EM burst. But statistics can't relay the core truth. Some tragedies echo until someone listens. At Seaview, 2 lonely children and a guilt-racked purser finally had their story heard. And the inn, for the first time in 130 years, feels like a place meant for the living again. Let's move to our 8th story. And this one comes from Edison, a long-haul truck driver who's been running routes across the western United States for over 20 years. What he experienced at a seemingly ordinary roadside motel in the Nevada desert forced him to confront the possibility that not everyone who checks into a hotel is actually alive. Here's Edison's account, in his own words. "I've been driving truck for 23 years, and I've seen just about everything the road has to offer, good, bad, and weird. When you're out there for weeks at a time, covering thousands of miles through small towns and desert highways, you develop your routines and your regular stops. You find the truck stops with the cleanest showers, the diners with the best coffee, and the motels where you can get a decent night's sleep without worrying about your rig getting broken into. Mile marker 127. Motor Lodge has been one of my regular stops for over 15 years. It's located on a lonely stretch of Nevada highway, about 60 miles outside of Ely, right where I-80 meets that old mining road that used to service the copper mines back in the day. It's not much to look at. A single-story building with about 20 rooms, a small office, and a parking area that can accommodate maybe 8 or 10 big rigs. But the rooms are clean, the price is reasonable, and most importantly, it's positioned perfectly for my regular Phoenix to Reno route. I usually hit mile marker 127 on my northbound runs, typically arriving sometime between 8 and 10 p.m., depending on traffic and delivery schedules. Over the years, I've probably stayed there at least 60 or 70 times. And in all that time, I've only ever dealt with one desk clerk, an older gentleman named Frank, who always works the evening shift. Frank is probably in his 60s, with gray hair and these thick-rimmed glasses that make him look like an accountant. He's got this very precise way of speaking and always wears the same style of short-sleeved white shirt with a narrow black tie, like something from the 1960s. He's polite and professional, but not particularly chatty. Just takes your information, hands over the room key, and tells you checkout is at 11 a.m. What I always found remarkable about Frank was his consistency. Every time I stopped at mile marker 127, he was there working the desk, no matter what day of the week or what time I arrived. I figured he must live on the property, or maybe he was the owner, because I never saw anyone else working that shift in 15 years of stops. The routine was always the same. I'd pull into the parking lot, grab my overnight bag from the cab, and walk into the little office. Frank would look up from whatever paperwork he was doing, smile politely, and say, "Good evening. Welcome to mile marker 127. I'd tell him I needed a room for one night. He'd ask if I had any preference, and I'd usually request something away from the highway noise. He'd hand me a registration card to fill out. I'd pay cash, and he'd give me a room key attached to one of those heavy plastic keychains. The rooms themselves were basic but adequate. Double bed, small TV, bathroom with a shower that usually had decent water pressure. Nothing fancy but clean sheets and no surprises. I'd get a good night's sleep, check out in the morning, and continue on my route to Reno. Over the years, Frank and I developed what I guess you'd call a professional relationship. He'd remember that I preferred rooms on the back side of the building, and I'd always have exact change ready to speed up the check-in process. Sometimes, if I arrived early enough, we'd chat briefly about weather conditions or road construction, but mostly it was just business. What struck me about these conversations was how Frank always seemed to be living in the past. He'd make references to gas prices or current events that seemed outdated, and he had this old-fashioned way of speaking that reminded me of my grandfather. I chalked it up to him being from an older generation and maybe not keeping up with modern technology or news. The motel itself had that timeless quality that a lot of these old highway properties have. The furniture looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s. The carpet was that industrial-grade stuff designed to last decades, and even the room numbers were painted on the doors in a font that screamed mid-century design. But everything was well-maintained, and the place had a reliability that I appreciated as a driver who needed predictable accommodations. It wasn't until last September that I started to realize something wasn't quite right about my interactions with Frank. I'd been having some issues with my logbooks and needed to verify the dates of some of my recent stops for an audit my company was conducting. I keep detailed records of my routes, expenses, and overnight stops. So I started going through my receipts and comparing them to my mileage logs. That's when I noticed something strange about my receipts from mile marker 127. Every single receipt I had from that motel, going back over 10 years, was handwritten in the same careful script and dated with the same style of date stamp. Not only that, but the receipts themselves looked identical. Same paper, same letterhead design, even the same pen ink color. It was as if time had stopped at that front desk sometime in the late 1980s. I mentioned this to another driver, Tommy Rodriguez, who runs a similar route and sometimes stays at the same motels I do. When I described mile marker 127 and asked if he'd ever dealt with Frank, Tommy gave me this strange look and said he'd never seen an older guy working there. According to Tommy, the evening desk clerk was a young woman in her 20s who'd been there for maybe 2 years. This really bothered me because I was absolutely certain about my interactions with Frank. I had 15 years of consistent experiences with the same person using the same check-in process in the same office setup. Tommy and I compared notes about the motel's layout, the room configurations, even the color of the carpet. And everything matched except for our descriptions of the staff. I decided to do some research when I got home from that run. I looked up mile marker 127 Motor Lodge online and found very little information, just basic contact details and a few travel reviews that described it as a classic roadside motel with reliable service. But when I dug deeper into county records and business licenses, I found something that made my blood run cold. According to the Nevada Department of Motor Vehicles records, mile marker 127 Motor Lodge had been the site of a fatal car accident in October 1987. A desk clerk named Frank Morrison had been killed when a drunk driver lost control and crashed through the front office during the night shift. Frank had been working alone and died instantly from his injuries. The accident report described Frank as a 62-year-old man who'd been employed at the motel for about 8 years. The description matched perfectly. Gray hair, glasses, always wore white shirts and narrow ties. The report even mentioned that Frank was known for his professional demeanor and his habit of working most of the evening shifts because he lived alone and didn't mind the quiet hours. I sat in my kitchen reading this accident report over and over, trying to make sense of what it meant. If Frank Morrison had died in 1987, who had I been checking in with for the past 15 years? The dates didn't add up. The description was too accurate to be coincidental. And I had receipts documenting dozens of interactions with someone who was supposed to be dead. I called mile marker 127 that evening to try to get some clarification. A young woman answered the phone, and when I asked to speak with Frank, she seemed confused. She told me there was no Frank working there, and that she was the only evening desk clerk. When I described my usual check-in routine and mentioned my regular stays there, she said she'd never seen me before and suggested I might be thinking of a different motel. The next time my route took me through that area, I decided to stop at mile marker 127 during the day to see what I could learn. I pulled into the parking lot around 2 in the afternoon and walked into the office. The young woman behind the counter matched Tommy's description. Early 20s, blonde hair, completely different from the Frank I'd been dealing with for years. I asked her about the history of the motel and whether there had ever been a desk clerk named Frank Morrison. Her expression changed immediately, and she asked me how I knew that name. When I explained my long history of stays there and my interactions with Frank, she looked genuinely unsettled. She told me that Frank Morrison was something of a legend among the motel's staff. According to the current owners, who'd bought the property in the early 1990s, several guests over the years had reported checking in with an older gentleman who matched Frank's description. These reports were always from truckers or other regular travelers who claimed to have ongoing relationships with this mysterious desk clerk. The current management had eventually installed security cameras in the office area, partly because of these reports. What they found on the footage was disturbing. The cameras would show guests apparently having conversations with someone behind the desk, filling out registration forms, and receiving room keys. But there was never anyone visible on the employee side of the counter. She showed me some of this footage on her computer, and it was exactly as she described. I could see myself from previous visits, standing at the counter, clearly interacting with someone. But the area behind the desk appeared empty. The footage showed me filling out registration cards, placing money on the counter, and picking up room keys. But there was no one there to take my information or hand me the keys. What made this even more unsettling was that the registration cards I'd filled out during these visits were nowhere to be found. The motel had no record of my stays, no credit card charges, and no documentation that I'd ever been there, despite my detailed receipts and logbook entries. The desk clerk explained that they'd consulted with paranormal investigators about the Frank Morrison phenomenon, and the general consensus was that Frank had been so dedicated to his job that he'd never actually left his post, even after death. The investigators theorized that Frank continued to provide service to guests who genuinely needed accommodation, particularly long-haul truckers who depended on reliable, affordable lodging. According to their research, Frank only appeared to guests who fit a certain profile. Professional drivers who treated the motel with respect, paid in cash, and didn't cause problems. He seemed to be selective about who he served, focusing on people who reminded him of the customers he'd valued during his living years. Looking back on my interactions with Frank, this theory made a disturbing amount of sense. He'd always been most helpful to me during bad weather or when I was running behind schedule and really needed a place to stay. There were several occasions when I'd arrived late at night, worried that the motel might be full. only to have Frank assure me that he'd saved a room specifically for me. I also remembered that Frank had occasionally made comments about keeping the place running properly and ensuring that good drivers like yourself always have a place to stay. At the time, I'd assumed he was just taking pride in his work. But now I wondered if he was describing his continuing mission from beyond death. The most chilling part of this revelation was realizing that I'd been completely comfortable with these interactions for 15 years. Frank had never seemed ghostly or supernatural. He'd been as real and solid as any living person. We'd had normal conversations. He'd handled physical objects like registration cards and room keys, and he'd even made change for me when necessary. I haven't stayed at mile marker 127 since learning the truth about Frank Morrison. It's not that I'm afraid of him. He was always professional and helpful, and I never felt threatened during our interactions. But there's something deeply unsettling about the idea that I spent years having routine business conversations with a dead person without ever realizing it. Sometimes I wonder if Frank is still there, working his eternal night shift, taking care of drivers who need a safe place to rest. Part of me hopes he is, because in an industry where reliable service is hard to find, Frank Morrison provided exactly the kind of dependable, no-nonsense accommodation that keeps drivers safe on the road. Even death didn't stop him from doing his job. That was Edison's encounter at mile marker 127, where dedication to customer service transcends the boundaries between life and death. Let's move to our 9th story, and this one comes from me. Levi Peterson, a 22-year-old American exchange student who decided to spend the Easter break backpacking across southern Germany. I'd already knocked out Munich's beer halls, Neuschwanstein's turrets, and more youth hostel bunk beds than I care to remember when I stumbled on an online listing for Schloss Albtraum Hotel, a converted hilltop castle outside the Bavarian town of Falkenbruck. The listing promised dorm-style rooms for under €30, panoramic alpine views, and authentic medieval ambiance. Authentic sounded cool. Cheap sounded even better. I booked 2 nights and hopped a regional train the next morning. Falkenbruck turned out to be a one-platform station wedged between forested slopes. A chipped wooden sign pointed uphill, Schloss, 1.4 kilometers. The hike was brutal with a 60-liter pack, but the castle revealed itself like something out of a grim illustration: slate roofs, crenellated towers, and slit windows that looked more like arrow loops than guest amenities. A single paved drive wound through an iron gate bearing a coat of arms, a boar impaled on a spear. Not the friendliest symbol, but I'd slept in worse places. Inside the gate, a modern banner read, Schloss Albtraum Hotel, established, The contrast felt odd. Neon letters announcing hospitality bolted to stone blocks blackened by 600 winters. Reception occupied what must once have been the guardhouse. A woman named Fräulein König checked my passport with efficient nods and handed over a massive brass key engraved 23. She spoke rapid German that I only half understood. When I asked, "Alles gut, oder?" she smiled thinly and answered in practiced English, "Curfew is 11. Keep door locked. Do not explore service levels." Then she slid a printed sheet across the desk, listing breakfast times, Wi-Fi password, and a highlighted line. Basement areas off limits. Alarmed. My room sat in the north wing, 3rd floor. The corridor was a study in contradictions. Emergency exit signs glowing above doorways, carved for men who'd been 5 inches shorter than me. Motion sensors rigged to centuries-old sconces, and a faint smell of damp stone under lemon disinfectant. Room 23 itself held 2 IKEA bunks, a tiny ensuite shower stall, and a narrow, arrow-slit window overlooking the courtyard. Hardly regal, but the walls were a meter thick and the silence felt luxurious after hostile common rooms. I spent the afternoon exploring Falkenbrook, half-timbered houses, a bakery selling Quarkbällchen, and not much else. By dusk, I was back at the castle bar nursing a dunkel and chatting with two Australian travelers. They complained the Wi-Fi barely worked upstairs. I was more interested in the display cases lining the bar. Rusting manacles, a spiked iron collar, thumb screws, all captioned in German with dates from the early 1500s. A plaque claimed Schloss Albtraum had served as a regional, Gericht, court and prison, during the witch trials. I took a photo for my medieval studies professor and headed up to crash. Around midnight, I woke to the unmistakable clank of metal echoing through stone. At first, I blamed plumbing, but the rhythm didn't match pipes. It sounded deliberate, metallic dragging followed by a slam, as if someone were hauling chains across flagstones. I checked my phone. 0017. The Australians were snoring peacefully on the lower bunks. I pulled on jeans and slipped into the corridor. Cold air crawled across my ankles. The motion lights flickered on, then off, plunging everything into gloom. The chain sounds came again, fainter now, seemingly from below. Remembering the sheet's basement warning, I headed toward the main stairwell, planning to rat to reception. Maybe a staff member was doing late-night maintenance. Halfway down, I heard something stranger. Low German voices, words drawn out as if through pain. My vocabulary caught only a few: Gnade, mercy; Verrat, betrayal; Sünder, sinner. The voices grew clearer as I descended past reception toward a heavy oak door labeled Service, No Entry. A red LED on the knob blinked, yet the door stood ajar by an inch. I should have stopped there. Instead, I eased it wider. A stone stair vanished into darkness. The chain noise clattered again, followed by a child's scream so sharp it ricocheted inside my skull. My rational brain insisted this was some immersive tourist gimmick, maybe a medieval dungeon attraction prepping for the summer season. But my gut knew the scream had carried real terror. I backed away, letting the door close, and almost collided with Fräulein König. She materialized from the shadows, wearing a bathrobe, keyring in hand. Her expression froze between surprise and anger. "Guests must not open that door," she hissed. I stumbled through an apology, babbling about strange noises. She shook her head. "Old building. Sound travels." Her gaze softened a fraction. "Please, Herr Peterson, for your safety, stay on guest floors." Then she turned the deadbolt and walked off without another word. Back in bed, I told myself pipes, acoustics, overactive imagination. But I left the lamp on till dawn. Day 2 was gray and drizzly. I joined the Australians for the castle's heritage tour, hoping for answers. Our guide, Herr Bauer, wore a blazer embroidered with the boar and spear crest and carried an iPad loaded with slideshows. He explained that Schloss Albtraum dated to 1479, built by Graf Dietrich von Falkenbrook as both fortress and administrative seat. During the 1520s witch trials, the castle's lower levels housed interrogations overseen by the Graf's personal inquisitor, Bruder Matthias. According to local legend, Matthias pioneered psychological torment, preferring sleep deprivation and isolation to outright torture. Though Bauer gestured toward the spiked collar display as evidence that iron and fire were still used when confession stalled. The tour ended in the grand hall, now a conference space. I asked whether guests could see the original cells. Bauer's smile stiffened. "Regrettably not. The foundations are unstable." The Australians joked about ghosts. Bauer didn't laugh. That evening, the drizzle escalated to hammering rain. Wind whipped through the courtyard, rattling shutters. I curled on my bunk, flipping through a book when my phone vibrated. Unknown Bluetooth device detected. ALBTRAUMBLE05. Weird, given the castle's lousy Wi-Fi. I clicked connect. Instantly a voice burst from the phone speaker, hoarse, male, shouting in archaic German. The Australians jerked awake. Before I could translate, the screen flashed and the connection dropped. My phone's Bluetooth list was empty again. We checked the corridor. Dark, silent. The Aussies, wide-eyed now, decided beer was necessary. I said I'd catch up. I wanted to run a quick experiment. Using a portable audio recorder, I set it to voice activated and placed it just inside the service door's threshold. Koenig was nowhere around. I retreated upstairs to the bar where we swapped ghost stories until closing. At 11:15, Koenig ushered everyone to their rooms like a strict aunt. In 23, I retrieved the recorder, heart thudding. 38 minutes of file. I plugged in earbuds and scrubbed through. Static, footsteps, mine leaving, then silence. At the 12-minute mark, a metallic grind erupted, followed by muffled sobbing, female, maybe young. Then a man's voice, guttural, commanding. German words poured out, some familiar from Bauer's slide captions. Beichten, confess, Ruhe, repent. A loud splash echoed as if water bucketed onto stone. The girl's sobs cut off into choking gasps. My scalp prickled. The recorder timestamp read 22:37, minutes before curfew close. Sleep was impossible. Around 2 a.m., the Bluetooth ghost returned. My phone lit with ALBTRAUMBLE05. This time I hit record on video. The same male voice, shortest burst yet. 5 words. Ich finde dich, Verräter. I Googled. I will find you, traitor. The address list still showed no paired devices, yet my Bluetooth icon flickered blue as if connected. I sat shivering on the bunk until 4 a.m., then crept toward the service door armed with flashlight, phone camera, and the irrational conviction that something down there wanted witness. The bolt was latched, but the LED glowed green. Koenig must have forgotten to rearm the alarm. I slipped inside. Cold slapped me. The staircase spiraled twice before dumping into an antechamber lined with iron rings sunk into mortar. My flashlight beam found dark patches on the stone, maybe centuries-old blood or maybe mildew. But the smell, coppery even after ages, made me gag. Beyond lay the main cell block, 3 vaulted chambers, each fronted by iron bars. Inside the first, a wooden rack sagged under its own weight. Shackles dangled like abandoned jewelry. But it was the far chamber that rooted me. A figure hunched in the corner, elbows on knees, face buried in hands. I whispered, "Hello?" No answer. My breath clouded. The air temperature plummeted so fast, my phone warned of battery drain. I edged closer. The flashlight flickered. The figure lifted its head. A teenage girl, eyes huge with terror, face streaked in grime. Yet her outline wavered like candle flame in wind. She opened her mouth, soundless, but my ears filled with those Bluetooth words. Kommt. He's coming. Behind me, the stair door slammed, plunging everything into black. Heavy boots descended stone steps. A wheeze, wet and labored, echoed closer. I scrambled for the cell entrance, locked. The figure across the bars dissolved into shadow. My light died. The phone battery hit 0. Pure instinct sent me flat to the floor, squeezing beneath a bench bolted to the wall. The boots stopped inches from the cell. Keys rattled. Metal squealed as the door swung in. Then, a sensation I struggled to describe, pressure, like deep sea tonnage, folded the air. A roar burst inside my skull, half in German, half in a language older than empire. I smelled seawater, smoke, scorched hair. When consciousness returned, the chamber lay silent. Dim emergency lights flickered to life. Someone must have reset a breaker. Cell doors stood open. No footprints, no figure. But on the bench above me rested a rusted manacle and, impossibly, my dead phone. The screen glowed 606 and displayed one saved audio file, BLE-05-final.wave. I bolted upstairs, expecting alarms, police, Koenig's wrath. Instead, the corridors were empty. Dawn light threaded through arrow slits. My bunk room door hung ajar. Aussies still slept. I packed in 10 minutes, thundered down to reception, and found Koenig already at the desk as if she'd never left. I slammed the manacle on the counter. "Explain," I demanded. She stared, whispering, "You entered the depths?" Tears welled. Foolish boy. Now he is loose. She refused to elaborate, but waved my bill and pressed a train timetable into my hand. "Leave before full day," she pleaded. I did. On the platform, I played the mystery audio. It captured everything. My footsteps, the door slam, the boots, the roar. Then a final female whisper in perfect English. "Thank you. Run." Back in Munich, I emailed Bauer the file. He replied hours later, "Never contact me again. Schloss Albtraum closed indefinitely this morning. Incident under investigation." German news reported only a brief notice. Castle shut due to structural hazards. Weeks later, a DHL package arrived at my dorm. Inside, Bauer's embroidered blazer patch, the boar skewered on a spear, and a note. "Some stories need witnesses. Keep your recording safe, and never delete device ALBDRAUMBLE05. I powered my phone. Bluetooth list showed nothing until midnight, when the icon blinked blue and a new device appeared, ALBTRAUMBLE06. Let's move to our 10th story. And this one comes from me. Graham Ellison, a senior field adjuster for North Shield Insurance Group. I've spent most of my 14-year career crawling through soggy basements after burst pipes and deposing claimants who insist their diamond earrings were stolen by ghosts. I've heard every excuse in the book, so it takes a lot to rattle me. But what happened during an investigation at Toronto's Executive Suites downtown in November 2022 still keeps me glancing at mirrored elevator panels, half expecting a man who's been dead for decades to appear over my shoulder. Here's the full account. My involvement began with a stack of accident files that landed on my desk like a dare. 5 unrelated policyholders, different companies, different industries, had reported injuries sustained while staying on the Executive Suite's 22nd floor over a 6-month span. 2 fractured wrists, 1 sprained ankle, a concussion, and 1 fatal fall from a window. All 5 swore they'd seen a businessman in an 80s power suit lurking outside their rooms or inside a conference suite moments before their accidents. The pattern screamed fraud ring, but the details were too weird for the usual staged loss crew. My supervisor flagged the claims as potentially connected to a past wrongful death suit the hotel settled quietly in 1997, then told me to go kick the tires. I arrived on a gray Wednesday, rolling a battered carry-on stuffed with boilerplate release forms, a pocket cannon for documentation, and my standard digital recorder. The lobby looked like every other upscale business hotel: granite reception desk, abstract art, a bar where muted televisions looped market news. Check-in was painless. The clerk handed me a key card to room 2213 and offhandedly mentioned that the elevators to 22 were being temperamental. Corporate for some guests are complaining. Noted, elevator A dinged open. Polished chrome interior, faint citrus cleaner scent. I pressed 22. The car shuddered upward. At floor 16, the lights flickered, then steadied. My reflection quivered in the mirrored panel. Navy suit, rain-spotted trench coat, hair that would need a trim before Christmas. Normal. But when the car glided to a stop and the doors parted, a blast of stale cold air hit me as though I'd stepped into a meat locker. The 22nd floor's corridor lighting ran on motion sensors. They blinked awake laggardly, revealing a stretch of taupe carpet and numbered doors. No hotel music, just an odd hush beneath the HVAC hum. I wheeled to 2213. My card beeped green. Inside, king bed, ergonomic chair, wall-mounted TV, and dominating the opposite wall, a panoramic window overlooking Bay Street's towers. Rain sketched diagonal lines across the glass. I placed a pen cap upright on the dresser, my low-tech test for vibration, then began photographing the room. Everything appeared standard until I reached the window latch. The restrictor bar, a safety feature preventing it from opening more than 4 inches, hung loose, screws missing. My stomach tightened. That matched the fatal fall file. I phoned maintenance. A tech promised to swing by. While waiting, I pulled the accident reports from my bag. 2 injuries occurred in room 2215, adjacent to me. The concussion case originated in 2221. The broken wrist in 2210. A cluster. I filled a legal pad with notes and drew a floor plan sketch, marking times of incidents. Nearly all happened between 10 p.m. and midnight. Maintenance knocked. A young guy named Dell. He resecured the restrictor, but when I mentioned the pattern of accidents, he stiffened. "That floor's got history," he muttered, glancing toward the hall. "You doing risk assessment?" I nodded. He lowered his voice. "Look up Alan Potter. Died here 95. People say he never left." Before I could probe, his radio crackled and he hurried off. Alan Potter? The name rang a faint bell. Back in my room, I dug through the fatal fall records. There it was. Alan Douglas Potter, age 44, Regional Sales Vice President for Miratech Systems. On November 11th, 1995, he'd allegedly leapt from the 22nd floor conference suite during a late-night strategy meeting. Official ruling: suicide due to work stress. An internal memo from a 1997 civil suit, however, suggested equipment failure, window restrictor missing, and hinted the hotel settled with Potter's widow. If liability resurfaced, the policy losses could be enormous. At 6 p.m., I headed downstairs for interviews. First stop, security control. Supervisor Yi let me review incident footage. The cameras on level 22 were high-angle fisheyes, black and white feeds stored for 30 days. The night of the latest claim, a fractured wrist in 2021-5, showed something odd. At 22:46, the corridor lights activated, though no figure appeared. 20 seconds later, a door in the camera's blind spot slammed. The lights went dark. The claimant exited holding his wrist, slipping as he rushed toward the elevators. Before the feed cut, a silhouette reflected briefly on the chrome door. A man in a broad-shouldered suit, standing impossibly close behind the injured guest, yet never caught by the main lens. Gooseflesh climbed my arms. I asked Yi if anything similar turned up around other claim times. He ran a search. 4 matches where the lights awakened without a visible subject. In each, reflective surfaces hinted at the same outline. Suit jacket squared at the shoulders, hair slicked back, posture rigid. My skepticism wrestled with instinct. Reflection artifacts? Compression glitches? Maybe. Still, I requested copies and departed. In the restaurant, I met Karen Dubois, an executive assistant for a Montreal biotech firm and the concussion claimant. She'd agreed to recount her incident for a small settlement incentive. Her version: She'd left a late meeting in the 22nd floor boardroom. The corridor lights were out as she approached the elevators. They flicked on, revealing a tall man facing the wall as if studying a painting. She apologized for startling him. He turned. His eyes were wrong, she whispered, fingers tracing the rim of her water glass. She stepped backward, tripped over her rolling briefcase, and struck her head. When she looked up, he'd vanished. I asked for description. Gray pinstripe suit, maroon tie, outdated lapel pin. Miratech logo? She wasn't sure. By 10, I was mentally drafting a report citing faulty lighting and security lapses. The supernatural angle, unsubstantiated. Back in 2213, I reviewed my cam footage. At 10:37, the hallway curtsy lights under my door strobed twice, though no footsteps passed. I checked the pen cap on the dresser, now tilted at 20 degrees. Building vibration? Maybe a neighboring door slammed. Yet the motel felt unnervingly still. I prepared for bed, leaving my recorder active on the desk. I woke at 2:11 a.m. to voices. Male, low, measured cadence, like someone rehearsing a pitch. Through the wall? I pressed an ear to the connecting panel, locked. The speech sounded nearer, inside my room, though the air felt empty. Recorder red LED blinked. I squinted at the window. Faint silhouette, shoulders squared, facing Bay Street lights. Heart pounding, I snapped on the bedside lamp. The figure dissolved. But the window restrictor bar hung loose again, swinging gently. Adrenaline fired protocol. I photographed the latch, time-stamped, then secured it with a spare flathead from my kit, tight, immovable. Next, I replayed the recorder. It captured 15 seconds of hushed audio. Quarterly earnings, expansion potential. They'll see. A clack, probably the loose restrictor bar. Then a sigh so heavy it sounded drenched in exhaustion. They never listen. My own startled gasp ended the clip. Sleep was over. I set up a motion-activated GoPro on the windowsill and emailed my supervisor, flagging a potential safety hazard requiring urgent hotel action. Then curiosity got the better of fear. If Alan Potter's patterns repeated, the conference suite, room 2201, was ground zero. I grabbed flashlight, master key courtesy of management cooperation, and stepped into the corridor. Lights triggered 2 seconds late, bathing the carpet in anemic glow. I passed 2215. Door frame bore fresh spackle where the claimant's wrist had slammed. At 2201, I swiped the key. The heavy door groaned. Inside lay a classic boardroom. Long mahogany table, 12 leather swivel chairs, cityscape backdrop. The window panes towered floor to ceiling, restrictors intact. Yet the air reeked faintly of stale tobacco, a smell long purged from modern hotels. I circled inspecting hardware. By chair 3, scratches marred the sill. I knelt, the pattern aligned with someone gripping before impact. My phone vibrated, motion alert from GoPro. I pivoted toward the hallway. Nothing. I opened the app. The thumbnail showed my room dark, GoPro IR capturing a figure by the glass. Same silhouette. It turned its head toward the camera, face blurred as if overexposed, then stepped forward and vanished mid-stride. Timestamp, 2:42. Ice water coursed my spine. I retreated into the corridor. The hall lights were already on, yet shadows pooled unnaturally around the elevator bank. As I neared, elevator B dinged open, uncalled. Inside stood nobody, but faint shoe prints outlined in moisture dotted the floor, facing inward as though someone had just stepped off. I swallowed hard and took the stairs. Down at reception, The night auditor eyed me warily. I recounted the restrictor defect. He logged a ticket. Then I asked straight, "You ever hear about Potter?" The auditor exhaled. "Folks say he's stuck prepping for a meeting that never happens. Shows up when pressure's high, month-end, audits, conferences." He glanced toward the business center glass wall. "I've seen him. Thought he was real till he faded out." Dawn broke over a city washed clean by rain. I spent daylight hours combing the Ontario court archives. Buried microfiche detailed depositions from Potter's colleagues. Management had threatened massive layoffs. Potter's division was underperforming. During the marathon meeting, he was berated by executives, called a failure. Shortly after 1 a.m., he approached the window, said, "I'll show you quarterly impact," and fell 22 stories. Contradictory testimonies about whether the window had been forced open lingered until the hotel's insurers settled. Back at executive suites, I requested access to the maintenance logs. Over the years, every incident, loose restrictor screws, flickering corridor lights, malfunctioning elevators, clustered around audit weeks and financial summits. Always floor 22. My actuarial mind crunched odds. Too coincidental. Night 2, I staged my own board meeting. In 2201, I set the table. Laptop booted to a fictional Miratech Q4 slide deck, notepad scribbled with growth projections, coffee steaming. Then I spoke aloud. "Alan, quarterly earnings projections revised downward. Need your input." Silly? Maybe. But investigations require creativity. 20 minutes passed. Nothing. I closed the laptop. The window pane fogged with breath on the inside. Letters etched into condensation. Wrong. I froze. The GoPro on the table whirred. The pane trembled, as if struck from outside 22 stories up. The restrictor bolts sheared with a metallic snap. Cold rush of night air. Invisible weight pressed against my shoulder, steering me toward the sill. Terror surged. I shouted, "Alan, stop!" The pressure eased. The breath fog letters smeared into streaks, then cleared. I rebolted the restrictor using longer stainless screws from my kit and coated threads with epoxy. Permanent. "Meeting adjourned," I said, voice shaking. On playback, my recorder captured a faint reply layered with wind. "Appreciated." Elevator cameras later showed lights flicker down the corridor as though someone walked away. I filed my final report recommending the hotel retrofit all restrictors, overhaul lighting sensors, and install psychological risk signage. I could not, of course, write hostile spectral entity. But I appended a quiet note. Suggest memorial plaque in boardroom acknowledging Alan Potter, died in service 1995. Risk management approved. Human factors, they said, help deter litigation. 3 weeks later, the hotel concierge emailed a photo. A bronze plate mounted beside 2201's entrance. In loving memory of Alan D. Potter, whose work ethic and dedication inspired those who followed. Since installation, not a single injury claim has arisen from floor 22. Still, whenever I audit accident patterns, I think about late-night elevators and men burdened by performance charts who never clocked out. And sometimes, during site inspections, I open windows an extra inch just to make sure a restrictor holds. Because numbers can't quantify the weight of one man's despairs echoing through decades. Looking for a meeting that finally, mercifully, ended. Let's move to our 11th story. And this one comes straight from me. Lauren Vega, a burnt-out graphic designer who thought a quiet foliage getaway in rural Vermont would cure my creative block. Instead, Grandma Rose's bed and breakfast became the most unsettling stop on my lifelong quest for cozy lodgings. Everything you're about to hear happened over a single October weekend in 2023. And I still can't decide whether Grandma Rose was trying to protect me or imprison me. I booked the B&B impulsively after scrolling past a photo of a white clapboard farmhouse framed by blazing maples. The listing promised farm-to-table breakfasts, quilt-lined rooms, and the warm embrace of old-fashioned hospitality. Reviews gushed about the innkeeper, Rose Adler, always Grandma Rose, who treated every guest like cherished family. Exactly the vibe I craved after 3 caffeine-fueled all-nighters. The drive from Burlington wound through Amber Hills until GPS lost signal. Hand-painted placards reading "Fresh Pies" and "You're Almost Home" pointed the way down narrower lanes. At dusk, I crested a ridge, and the house appeared, lanterns glowing on the wraparound porch. In the yard stood an ancient maple whose branches curled over the roof like protective arms. Rose greeted me at the door. Late 70s, apple-cheeked, gray hair in a bun, flour dusting her apron. "You must be Lauren. I kept supper warm." Her voice had the lilting comfort of a lullaby. Inside smelled of cinnamon, wood smoke, and something floral I couldn't place. Room 6 sat at the end of the upstairs hall. Patchwork quilt, rocking chair, braided rug. Charming but faintly sepia, as though time moved slower here. A guest book on the dresser listed decades of visitors. I noticed an odd pattern. Nearly every entry ended with variations of "extended stay. Thanks, Grandma." Some stays were weeks long, one even 3 months. Downstairs, Rose served chicken pot pie, insisting I take seconds. Conversation felt effortless until she asked when I'd be leaving. "Sunday morning," I said, cutting another bite. Her smile twitched. "We'll see," she murmured, almost too softly to hear. That night I slept soundly until 3:07 a.m., when a metallic clang echoed beneath the floorboards, followed by a faint shuffle outside my door. I opened it to an empty hall, the air thick with rose water. From downstairs drifted the slow creak of a rocking chair and the distant hum of an old woman's song. Brahms' lullaby, I realized. The clock read 3:11. I chalked it up to pipes, settled back in, and told myself vacations require imagination. Morning sunlight dispelled the unease. The breakfast table groaned with pancakes, apple butter, and thick-cut bacon. 2 other guests, Melissa and Jonah, a couple from Providence, looked exhausted. "Couldn't sleep," Melissa whispered when Rose stepped into the kitchen. Doors kept jamming. Jonah's phone alarm never rang. Jonah nodded, eyes rimmed crimson. Rose returned with more syrup, and conversation halted. After breakfast, I explored the property. Behind the barn, I found a 1-lane dirt path marked "Guests Only, Scenic Walk." The trail meandered through pine stands until it reached a rusted farm gate chained but not locked. Beyond lay the county road. My rental car was a half-mile the other direction. I tried the gate. It wouldn't budge even after I slipped the slack chain free. Back at the house, my car key fob refused to unlock the doors. Dead battery? I shrugged and planned to grab a replacement later. Inside, Rose was boxing oatmeal cookies for your drive tomorrow. Her phrasing chilled me. Tomorrow was only Saturday. Late afternoon clouds rolled in. Melissa burst into the parlor clutching her suitcase. "Our car won't start," she hissed. "Battery's fine. Something's draining it." Rose appeared with cocoa. "Storm's coming. Best to stay put." Lightning cracked. The couple retreated to their room. That evening the power flickered, died, then returned dimmer, as though the bulbs had aged decades. Rose lit oil lamps. "Generator's fussy," she said. We dined on beef stew. Conversation was subdued. Rose insisted I try her dandelion wine, pouring from a decanter that looked antique. It tasted of honey and earth. I excused myself early, uneasy. Upstairs, I opened the guest book again. Earlier entries suddenly read differently. Thank you for a safe place to stay. Car troubles, but Grandma fixed everything. Another, meant to leave yesterday, but lost the road. Bless you, Rose. Ink smudges suggested hastily added lines. At 11:50 p.m., my phone buzzed. Zero signal, yet an alarm I hadn't set flashed. Checkout canceled. The screen dimmed to black. Footsteps creaked outside. I cracked the door. Grandma Rose stood at the hallway's far end, silhouetted by lamplight, singing the lullaby. She turned and descended the stairs without seeming to step. I followed. She entered the kitchen. I paused at the threshold. Rose spoke, voice overlapping itself as if two versions of her spoke half a beat apart. Stormy nights aren't for driving. Roads get lost. Best stay. She moved toward the cellar door, padlock in hand. As it clicked shut, the lullaby grew louder, not from Rose, but beneath the floor, sung by many voices in harmony. I backed away, heart hammering. My car key flickered in my pocket. The fob light flashed green. Adrenaline surged. I sprinted upstairs for my bag. The hallway lengthened impossibly. Rugs stretched like taffy. Every door slammed as I passed. Rose's voice floated up the stairwell. You'll catch cold? I reached room 6, grabbed my backpack, and ran. On the porch, the night air smelled of wet leaves and rosewater. The rental unlocked on the first press. Engine roared to life. Headlights stabbed rain as I sped down the driveway. In the rear view, Grandma Rose stood in the road, apron blowing, one hand raised in benediction or farewell. The GPS revived 3 miles out. No storm damage, no fallen trees, just winding road back to town. At a gas station, I popped the trunk to stow my bag and found Rose's cookie box. Inside, beneath wax paper, lay my phone, battery now full, and a note in looping script. Sometimes guests leave too soon. Remember to call back home. Rose. I never found Grandma Rose's B&B online again. The listing vanished, phone number out of service. County records list the farmhouse as abandoned since 1978 after owner Rose Adler died peacefully in her rocking chair. I still taste rosewater when autumn storms roll in, and my phone occasionally plays Brahms' lullaby at 3:11 a.m., alarm disabled. I let it play just in case Grandma's checking that I made it home safe. If stories like these keep you up at night, smash that subscribe button and join the Verified Fears family. Turn on notifications so you never miss a chilling premiere, and drop your own haunted hotel experience in the comments. Your nightmare might be our next feature. Stay curious, stay brave, and remember, some checkouts are forever.